I just want my kid to be happy. Have you found yourself saying or thinking that? For most parents, it's our deepest wish. In some sense, everything we do for our children is aimed at their present or future happiness. We remind them to brush their teeth, help them with their homework, drive them to soccer practice, all because we want our kids to be happy. But what do we mean by happiness? It's not just the absence of pain, and it's more than momentary enjoyment. Eating a cookie makes children feel good while they're doing it, but what we want for our kids is deeper and more lasting than that. As parents, we hate to see our children suffer, but they do. The anguish that a teen feels over a failed test or a romantic breakup is genuine, and so is the hurt of an elementary school child whose sports team loses or who doesn't get invited to a birthday party. And when a sandwich gets cut the wrong way, a toddler's distress is very real, even if it's not reasonable. So our goal can't be to have children who are always happy. That's just not realistic, and it's disconnected from children's real-life experience. But we do want our children to be open to happiness and to believe that the good in their lives outweighs the bad. Researchers have tried to measure happiness in many different ways. Asking people, "How happy are you right now?" taps into their current experience. This is not the same as asking them, "How happy were you during that event?" which involves summarized, remembered experience. We can also look at people's judgments about their circumstances by asking, "How happy are you about your life overall?" or "How happy are you about this particular aspect of your life?" The answers to these different types of questions about happiness are related but not identical, which makes it very hard to come up with any general conclusions about what causes happiness. We also know that there are individual and cultural differences in what types of happiness people value. For instance, Jean Tsai at Stanford University and her colleagues found that compared to Hong Kong Chinese college students, European American college students place more value on high arousal feelings, such as excited, enthusiastic, and elated. But the Chinese students place more value on low arousal feelings, like calm, peaceful, and relaxed. Asian American students are in the middle. They value high arousal feelings more than the Chinese students do, and they value low arousal feelings more than the European Americans do. And there are age-related preferences for different types of positive emotions. A study looking at emotion words in the Facebook posts of 70,000 people ranging in age from 13 to over 65 found that the word excited peaked in use among 20-somethings, then dropped steadily with age, while the use of the word proud and grateful rose steadily with age. Recently, my husband and I went for a walk on the beach with our two youngest children, who are in middle school and high school. It was toward evening on a cool day, so the beach was almost empty, and my husband and I walked along the shore, just watching the waves and enjoying the time together as a family. Meanwhile, our daughters sprinted ahead and then dashed back to hand us some shells to carry, then took off to do cartwheels on the sand. We all felt very happy, but the kids' happiness was exuberant, while the grown-ups' happiness was more about feeling peaceful and content. Despite all these different perspectives on happiness, what's clear from research is that happiness matters, and not just because it feels good. Happiness isn't just a sign of well-being, it can actually lay the groundwork for positive outcomes. Barbara Fredrickson at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, has developed a broaden and build theory of positive emotions. Laboratory studies show us that inducing negative moods tends to narrow people's focus, but inducing positive moods broadens people's attention. Positive moods also help people think more creatively and flexibly, and makes them more open to new experiences and learning. Plus, positive moods make interactions with other people more enjoyable. Over time, short-term positive moods can lead to long-term benefits by promoting exploration, good coping, and healthy relationships. So positive emotions allow us to broaden our thoughts and experience, which helps us build further skills and resources, leading to even more happiness in an upward spiral of well-being. There are caveats, of course. Intense happiness can blind people to risks. And focusing on short-term happiness can sometimes get in the way of pursuing long-term goals if we're not willing to endure temporary discomfort on the way to greater satisfaction down the road. But overall, there's good evidence for this model from research in adults. And the broaden and build process is likely to be even more important for children because they're at the early stages of learning how to be in the world. Research tells us that most children are generally happy. In surveys, about 90% of children reported feeling at least somewhat happy with their overall life. Younger kids tend to be happier than older kids. In a global survey involving thousands of children, 3/4 of 6-year-olds reported feeling happy most of the time, but less than 2/3 of 12-year-olds felt that way. Unfortunately, some children are persistently very unhappy. Depression can strike kids as young as preschool, and about 1/5 of children experience a major depression by age 18. Depression looks different in kids than it does in adults. Rather than saying they feel sad, depressed children tend to be irritable. They have vague physical symptoms, complain about always being bored, and don't enjoy happy events or activities that used to bring them pleasure. Depressed kids aren't just whiny or spoiled, they're miserable. When children consistently hate their lives or hate themselves and they see no hope of things improving, they're genuinely hurting and they need help. If your child's unhappiness is persistent, meaning it lasts more than 2 weeks, and pervasive, meaning it colors how your child views most activities, and especially if your child also shows changes in sleep or appetite, please see a psychologist or other mental health professional. Depression is treatable, and early intervention can prevent a lot of suffering. As parents, we can't make our children happy. But what we can do is help them develop the skills and attitudes that are conducive to happiness. Marty Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania points to 3 aspects of the well-lived life identified by philosophers and psychologists: pleasure, engagement, and meaning. These are conceptually distinct and statistically separable, but in real life, they're often merged. For instance, spending time with friends can be pleasurable, engaging, and meaningful all at the same time. Adults who report being most satisfied with their lives describe them as being high on all 3 of these dimensions. So it makes sense to help our children learn to cultivate and integrate pleasure, engagement, and meaning in consistent and lasting ways. Let's talk first about pleasure. I remember one time when my youngest child was about 4 years old, she and I were running errands in town, and she said to me, "I love putting money in the parking meter." And she absolutely meant it. Young children have a wonderful capacity to find delight in the ordinary. As they get older, children become more self-conscious, more concerned about what other people think of them, and more critical of people, objects, and activities. For some children, this new critical thinking ability can lead to a habit of negativity that involves focusing on the negative and dwelling on the downside. They become quick to pronounce, "That's so lame." Some kids seem to feel it's their job to criticize and judge everything out there. But focusing on what's wrong dampens their ability to enjoy positive experiences. Few things in life are 100% positive, so believing that we can only be happy if everything is perfect stands in the way of our happiness. Helping children move past negativity requires a delicate touch. It's about inviting an openness to pleasure rather than pushing for a perky cheerleader response. If we badger our kids by saying, "See, wasn't that fun? Didn't I tell you you'd have a good time?" they're likely to grumble, "It wasn't that fun." When our kids are feeling contrary, the more we argue, "It's wonderful," the harder they'll dig their heels in and insist, "It stinks." Teenagers sometimes go through a crabby period, at least at home. I remember one time, it was about 10 o'clock at night, and my husband and I were puttering in the kitchen, when our oldest daughter, who was about 17 at the time, wandered down and announced, "I hate all of my clothes." I responded with a therapeutic, because I wasn't going to do anything about it at that time of night. Then she said, "I hate the food in this house. There's never anything good to eat." I said, "Well, I just went grocery shopping. We have lots of nice fruit." She said, "I hate fruit." Then she pulled out her lunchbox for the next day, and she said, "I hate lunch. I hate making lunch, and I hate eating lunch." I said, "There's some homemade chili left over from dinner. Why don't you take that? You can put it in a thermos." And she said, "I hate spoons." Well, at that point, my husband and I just burst out laughing, which was perhaps not the most empathic response. If I'd been on my toes, I could have said, "You seem grumpy, what's going on?" But the spoon thing was just too ridiculous, and you gotta keep a sense of humor with kids. Well, the story doesn't end there. A few days later, a friend of mine who had heard this story called me up and said, "Eileen, you're not gonna believe what happened." It turns out her teenage daughter was eating some ramen noodles and getting frustrated because they kept sliding off of her fork. So my friend suggested, "Why don't you use a spoon?" And her daughter responded, "I hate spoons." Well, my friend practically fell on the floor laughing, and her daughter was very offended by this reaction. But apparently there was a bit of an epidemic of spoon hating going on in our town. Now, how we deal with whiny children depends on the situation. With young children, whininess often means they're tired and need to go to bed. Actually, that's often the root of teenage crabbiness, too. Sometimes the problem is not the complaint, but the way it's expressed. Kids don't necessarily realize when they're whining, but we can help them learn that we only listen to complaints expressed in a pleasant tone of voice. Sometimes just acknowledging the feeling behind a complaint can help kids move past it. Rather than leaping in to fix the situation, we can help our kids brainstorm solutions. We could say, with genuine interest rather than sarcasm, "That's a tough situation. What do you think you could do about it?" If you and your child are experiencing a shared difficulty, you may be able to use it as an opportunity to practice looking for the silver lining. So, for example, if you're stuck together waiting in a long line, you can play what I call the "well at least" game. Take turns imagining how circumstances could be even worse. You can do this in a serious way, "well, at least we already ate lunch," or a silly way, "well, at least the store isn't playing polka music," depending on what you think would appeal to your child. But more important for our children's happiness than limiting whining is to help them relish positive experiences. Fred Bryant at Loyola University has done extensive research on what he calls savoring. This involves thoughts and actions that enhance and prolong positive feelings. Savoring helps us squeeze as much enjoyment as possible from our daily lives. It could involve vividly anticipating or remembering positive experiences, focusing intentionally on current positive experience, or sharing positive feelings and experiences with others. Adults who regularly practice savoring tend to be happier and more optimistic. Kids sometimes do savoring on their own, but they can learn to do it more frequently and consistently. Relishing food is an easy way for kids to learn about savoring. Have you ever seen your child eat an Oreo cookie by twisting it apart, then scraping out the inside, then dunking the rest of it in milk? This behavior wouldn't win any prizes for manners, but is actually a sign of emotional intelligence because it means that your child is understanding something about enhancing pleasure. The next time your family has a favorite meal or a special treat, involve your kids in discussing what's the best way to enjoy it. Big bites or little bites? Which parts first or last? Together or separate? It's not only food that can be savored. Reminiscing about happy events allows us to relive and extend our pleasure in them. After your family does something fun together, maybe as you're traveling home, ask your child some questions like, what was your favorite part? Which did you like best? What did you like most about it? Be sure to share your reactions too, to provide an example of savoring. This kind of conversation helps your child stretch and draw out the pleasure of positive experiences. You can also use photos or souvenirs to prompt discussions of older happy memories. Help your child create a vivid narrative of the past by asking questions that highlight the sequence of events and the sensory details of the experience. You can ask, remember when? Remember how? And what happened next? Retelling favorite family stories is a very special form of savoring that's not only enjoyable, but also gives kids a sense of closeness and belonging. One time, my husband and I were out of town, and my father was in charge of watching the kids. Unfortunately, he didn't have a lot of experience with domestic matters, so he accidentally put hand dishwashing detergent in the dishwasher. At first, nothing happened, but then, as the wash cycle got going, frothy bubbles started spilling out at the top of the dishwasher. My father and the kids tried to use a sponge and bucket to contain the mess, but that wasn't enough. The dishwasher kept chugging away, and more bubbles spewed out, covering the kitchen floor. They spread out all the beach towels, but the bubbles kept coming and coming as my dad and the kids worked frantically to scoop them up. And when the dishwasher cycle was finally done and everything was mopped up, do you know what the kids said? Can we do it again? This is a simple story about a silly event, but it's one of my children's favorite family stories. It always makes them smile and chuckle to think about it. The biggest source of pleasure for children is play, especially outdoor play. Too often, this gets shunted aside by our busy schedules. Richard Louv, author of Last Child in the Woods, coined the term nature deficit disorder to call attention to what he believes are the symptoms of alienation from nature. These include attention problems, obesity, anxiety, and depression. Nature deficit disorder isn't a real medical or psychiatric condition, but giving kids more time to play outside can certainly add to their pleasure, and it helps reduce children's stress. When my children were young, everybody outside was my parenting answer to what ails you. Just being outside with space to breathe and run and explore seems to make everyone feel happier and more relaxed. We know from research with adults that even 5 minutes of green exercise, which means exercise in the presence of nature, can enhance mood. And being able to move around outdoors is even more important for active kids. In addition to pleasure, the second aspect of happiness that Seligman talks about is engagement. For children, I think it makes sense to think of engagement in terms of a willingness to discover, learn, and grow. It's about being deeply interested and fully involved in the world around them. The prime example of engagement is the concept of flow. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi at Claremont Graduate University originally developed this concept by watching artists at work. He noticed that while the artists were painting, they became completely absorbed in what they were doing. They lost track of time and were utterly unself-conscious because they were just so immersed in the process of creating. Csikszentmihalyi went on to study flow in many other groups of people, including train engineers, rock climbers, athletes, musicians, surgeons, factory workers. What he found is that the more flow people have in their lives, the happier they are. Flow can be exhilarating, and it's profoundly satisfying. We're most likely to experience flow when the challenge of the task matches our ability. If the challenge is too high, we feel anxious. If the challenge is too low, we feel bored. Surprisingly, adults are more likely to experience flow at work than during their leisure time at home. Now, this doesn't mean we should work all the time. It does mean that we should think about the kinds of activities that give us a sense of flow and make an effort to do them. And I think it's important to explain to our kids this idea of flow, of losing ourselves in an engrossing activity that's also challenging, so they can start to think about what activities help them find flow. Just like with pleasure, younger kids sometimes seem smarter than older kids about the engagement aspect of happiness. A 1-year-old who is learning to walk embraces the challenge without fretting about all the times she's fallen. But a 7-year-old might refuse even to try to ride her bike if she doesn't think she can do it. And a teenager might feel dejected and miserable if he's not the best at an activity. So even though older kids are more competent than little ones, they may have perfectionistic thinking that gets in the way of their engagement with challenging activities. Perfectionism is a tricky issue. On the one hand, having high standards encourages us to excel. On the other hand, perfectionism is linked to depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and eating disorders. Perfectionism can also cause procrastination and kill creativity because it makes us afraid of making mistakes. It's easiest to distinguish between healthy striving and unhealthy perfectionism at an emotional level. Healthy striving feels hopeful, energetic, and enjoyable. It's driven by a personal desire for mastery. Perfectionism feels forced, painful, and never-ending. It's focused on performance and driven by a dread of humiliation and a fear of failure. So how do we help our children break free of perfectionism? We have to help them learn to embrace struggle and tolerate mistakes. One way to do this is to help children understand the process of learning. Here's how I explain it to kids. Draw a vertical rectangle, open at the top. The bottom third of the rectangle is filled with check marks. That's the mastery zone. Those are the tasks that you get right every single time because they're too easy. The top third of the rectangle is filled with X's. That's the undeveloped zone. You get those tasks wrong every single time because you just haven't learned those skills yet. They're too hard. The middle section of the rectangle is the interesting part. It's called the learning zone. It's filled with a mixture of check marks and X's. Now, some kids only want to work in the mastery zone because they're afraid of making mistakes. But some kids are brave enough to work in the learning zone, which means that they're going to get some things wrong. But if they stick with it, if they keep studying and practicing, here's what happens. Those X's in the learning zone turn into check marks. So the mastery zone gets bigger, the learning zone moves up, and the undeveloped zone, well, that goes on forever because there's always more we can learn. Another antidote to perfectionism is curiosity. Todd Kashdan at George Mason University argues that curiosity is the central ingredient of a fulfilling life. Curiosity can be deeply engaging. It pulls us toward challenge and exploration. It may even make kids smarter. A longitudinal study found that kids who were highly curious at age 3 ended up being substantially more intelligent than their peers at age 11. This difference was evident even when the researchers statistically controlled for initial levels of intelligence. In our current educational climate of teaching to the test, mind-numbing worksheets, and heavy homework loads, I think it has become essential for parents to keep our children's curiosity alive. We can do this by modeling. Share interesting things that you learn with your child. Wonder aloud about things that pique your interest. We can also do this through shared exploration. Learn a new skill together. Plan family outings and little adventures that allow you and your child to discover new places. Or let your child teach you about something where your child is the expert. But supporting our children's engagement doesn't have to mean providing a three-ring circus of entertainment at all times. In fact, allowing our children plenty of unstructured leisure time gives them the space they need to discover and pursue their own interests. Your child won't necessarily thank you for this. In fact, you may hear vigorous complaints along the lines of, "I'm bored, there's nothing to do." Your child will moan and groan and sprawl bonelessly. But usually, if you just hold on, if you resist the temptation to provide suggestions, which you know your child will reject anyway, something wonderful will happen. Your child will think of something to do. So far, we've talked about pleasure and engagement. The third aspect of happiness that Seligman highlights is meaning. This involves feeling connected to something larger than the self. For children, this usually means relationships. An international survey asked children ages 6 to 12 to name things that made them feel safe and happy. Family was mentioned most frequently by far, followed by friends. One of the best ways to help your child develop meaningful relationships is by encouraging kindness. Research with college students consistently shows that doing acts of kindness makes people feel happy. This is easy to translate to children. When my kids were younger, we used to go around the dinner table and have each person report what kindness they did that day. A ritual like this not only sets the expectation that, kids should be doing something kind every single day, it also helps children see themselves as caring people who are capable of having a positive impact on others. You can drive this message home by commenting on how the act of kindness made the other person feel. So you can say things like, "Oh, I'm sure that was a big help to her," or "I bet that made him feel really good." If your child doesn't have a kindness to report, show little interest and just move on to the next kid if there is one, or else say, "Well, you have 2 hours left until bedtime. I'm sure you'll think of something kind you can do before then." Volunteering is a great way to add meaning to our lives, and it can lead to what's called the helper's high. It just feels good to know you're contributing to your community and making the world a better place. People who began volunteering as children are twice as likely to volunteer as adults compared to those who didn't. Talk with your child about what kinds of volunteer activities he or she would find most meaningful. Possibilities include walking dogs at a local shelter, teaching young children to read, or picking up litter at a local park. For many families, religion or spirituality is an important source of meaning because it promotes a sense of connection to a community and to God. A study involving children ages 8 to 12 found that children's spirituality, measured by endorsing statements like, "I believe in a higher power who watches over me," and "I desire to be closer to a higher power," this was strongly related to their happiness. Their religious practices, measured by questions like, "How often do you go to a place of worship, such as a church?" or "How often do you pray or meditate?" These were not related to happiness, probably because kids usually don't have much choice about things like attending religious services. So, we've talked about 3 aspects of happiness: pleasure, engagement, and meaning. These aspects sometimes overlap, but to be truly happy, children need at least some degree of all 3 of them. Without pleasure, life is drudgery. Without engagement, life is bland. Without meaning, life is empty. I want to close by touching on one more topic that's very important for understanding and promoting children's happiness, and that is resilience. Resilience is our capacity to thrive despite bad circumstances. It involves beating the odds by overcoming adversity or functioning well under challenging circumstances. It also can involve bouncing back after a traumatic experience. Ann Maston at the University of Minnesota calls this ordinary magic because thankfully, miraculously, resilience is common. 4 decades of research covering circumstances ranging from poverty to war to natural disasters shows that the ingredients that kids need in order to overcome difficult situations are very basic. Top of the list is an intimate connection to at least one competent and caring adult. We know, for example, that the negative effects of poverty are dramatically less if kids have a warm relationship with a parent. Having good community resources like effective teachers, kind friends, and safe neighborhoods also helps. Qualities of the child matter too. Kids do better in tough situations when they have good skills for problem solving, emotion regulation, and self-control. They also do better when they believe that life is meaningful and that they have the power to do things to get what they want or need. Believing that there's a spiritual dimension to the world that gives them hope is also helpful. Maston emphasizes that when these basic internal and external resources are in place, children can do well or even beautifully despite adversity. Of course, traumatic experiences affect children, but I've seen again and again in my practice, and research bears this out, that with appropriate support, children have an extraordinary capacity to move past difficulties and create happy lives. Throughout this lecture, we've talked about the attitudes and behaviors that contribute to happiness. Enduring happiness is more than just an absence of distress. It involves building a life that incorporates pleasure, engagement, and meaning. Happiness is not something we can give our children, but it's something that, with our guidance and support, they can create for themselves.